Welcome back. In this episode number 15, we're going to explore the concept of an OCR-Quality Risk Analysis. Just by way of a quick recap, this is number 3 of 3 different types of assessments or evaluations about which we've spoken. And by the way, all 3 of which are required in the HIPAA security rule. And furthermore, as a reminder, these are not once and done exercises. In all cases, they should be done on an ongoing basis, obviously the frequency of which is dependent on the size and nature and the change and evolution that's occurring inside of your organization. We'll come back to that point as it specifically relates to risk analysis a little further on in this presentation. I'm going to break some rules in terms of this particular episode. I've tried to limit the episodes to 8 to 10 minutes, and I've tried to focus in on 3 key fundamental elements. Today is going to be a little different. It's going to be a little longer, and additionally, the 3 items that I focus on are not so much fundamental elements. They're really concepts that underlie the whole idea of doing an OCR quality risk analysis. First and foremost, we're going to start with the concept of what does it take to have a risk? There are 3 fundamental components we will speak about. You need an asset, you need a threat, and you need a vulnerability. In the previous episode, I spoke about thinking like a compliance analyst. In this episode, I'll talk about thinking like a risk analyst. And last but not least, I'm going to delve into what's called the 9 essential elements of an OCR quality risk analysis that's based on documentation that OCR published way back in July of 2010. This is a long episode, as I mentioned a moment ago. Fasten your seatbelts. Before we dive in, as a quick reminder of where we are in our journey, we're in episode number 15. I plan to record a total of 30 episodes. I may do some changes and deletes and adds along the way, but so far I've made only a few. I would like to remind you, if you've not already done so, to subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you're notified of any updates or changes that we may make. Additionally, you may post any feedback there. And last but not least, if you have any friends or colleagues whom you believe may benefit from these episodes or the entire series, please feel free to share the YouTube link and channel. This slide exhibits the 3 main components of risk, all of which must be present in order for risk to exist. If any one of them is missing, there's no risk. If you have an asset without any threats to that asset, you don't have risk. If you have an asset which is very, very highly, securely protected, then you have no vulnerabilities. So in order for there to be risk, there needs to be an asset, a threat, and a vulnerability. For example, going back to our radiology department attack, the CT scan image is the asset. The attacker is the threat, and the vulnerability, in that case, at least one of them, was the lack of good physical security that enabled the attacker to make his or her way into the radiology department. Another vulnerability that we observed was the attacker was able to attach a Raspberry Pi device to the network without it being detected. You have a risk when you have all 3 present. Sometimes I refer to it as a triple or as a risk scenario. Another quick example. Suppose you have a laptop. The threat is a burglar breaking into your home or your office and stealing it. And one vulnerability might be the lack of encryption on that laptop. Let's look at a similar situation. Same laptop as an asset, same threat, the burglar, a new vulnerability, the organization uses weak passwords. In a last example, let me switch things up a little bit. The laptop is the same asset. The threat is a shoulder surfer looking over the shoulder of a home health clinician who's in between home visits in a Starbucks, for example. And the vulnerability is the absence of a privacy screen on that laptop. Think about risk in the form of the triples or the scenarios that involve all 3 of these components. Most organizations, and sadly most individuals, even those in the security field, confuse and mix up these terms. Additionally, journalists mix up these terms all the time. I was reading a Wall Street Journal article the other day that started out with a sentence, the risk of ransomware, etc., etc. Ransomware is not a risk, it's a threat. Importantly, insist that the individuals in your organization understand what these terms actually mean and to use them appropriately. Sadly, we often see them used interchangeably. One classic example is to have vulnerability reports spewed in front of the management team or the board as a representation of a risk analysis or the representation of the risk that the organization faces. It's not. It's a set of vulnerabilities. In the previous episode, I had a slide that talked about what it's like to think like a compliance analyst. And as you may recall, there were three fundamental questions. Is it documented? That is, do we have policies and procedures and other appropriate documentation? Number two, are we abiding by, applying, enforcing that which we've articulated in our policies and procedures? And number three, at the end of the day, are we doing something reasonable and appropriate? It's really focused, when you're thinking like a compliance analyst, it is focused on policies, procedures, practices, people, training, etc. On the other hand, thinking like a risk analyst is all about trying to get to the root and trying to understand what one's unique exposures are across the landscape of all the information assets in the environment that create, receive, maintain, or transmit electronic protected health information. And once one understands what those assets are, getting at the matter of exposures is the second point. What are all the ways in which there can be a compromise of confidentiality, integrity, and availability? And just as a quick reminder, the reason we're undertaking things like compliance gap assessments, conducting technical testing, and performing risk analyses is so that we understand where our weaknesses are, enabling us to then make informed decisions about the safeguards and controls that we're going to put in place. The risk analysis mission is to identify and prioritize all of one's unique exposures. Let's paint an even better picture of the risk landscape, beginning with the notion that we all own assets. Organizations own assets. We've talked about information assets. As owners of assets, we value them. And think about in the healthcare setting, happens to be a doctor using a laptop, and we'll stipulate for sake of discussion here that the laptop has electronic protected healthcare information on it. Think about it from a more personal point of view. You own assets. You probably have a home. You have an automobile. You may have a boat. You may have a vacation home. You probably have fine china. You might literally have jewelry. You have other assets. You value those. You don't want bad things to happen. You want to minimize risk. And risk can be thought of as loss or harm. Unfortunately, out of your direct control, there are threat sources out there, often bucketed in the form of adversarial threats, accidental threats, structural threats, and environmental threats. These threats give rise to threat actions that increase the possibility of loss or harm. Threat sources and threat actions are in the business of exploiting vulnerabilities that may exist in protecting your assets. But as a wise owner of assets, you may be aware of, or you wish to become aware of, what vulnerabilities exist. When you understand what those vulnerabilities are, you choose to implement safeguards and controls that are designed to reduce something not on this slide that we'll take up in the next episode, reduce the likelihood of the exploitation or reduce the impact were it to happen. This is the risk landscape. Notice all the various ingredients in risk, one of which is controls and safeguards. We're going to cover more in the next episode, but in the meantime, have this image in your mind as we think about the risk landscape. It's not just a matter of identifying threats that are out there. It's not just a matter of identifying vulnerabilities that may exist in your environment. When it comes to doing comprehensive risk analysis, you need to take into account the assets, the threats, and the vulnerabilities. Those in turn will enable you to assess likelihood and impact at the end of which you can then rank order your exposures so that you can make informed decisions about controls and safeguards. So if that constitutes the risk landscape, let's pivot over to what comprises an OCR quality risk analysis. What you see on this slide are what's called 9 essential elements of an OCR quality risk analysis. These are derived from the guidance that OCR published in July of 2010. These elements and the guidance from which they come constitute the basis on which OCR judges whether you have conducted a comprehensive enterprise-wide risk analysis. I would encourage you to download this document and have a close look at it. We're not going to go into detail in this session on all the elements and all the steps involved in conducting an OCR quality risk analysis. To do that, I would encourage you to have a look at the webinar that's listed at the bottom of this slide. One of my colleagues recently completed it and goes into great detail on conducting and what the steps are to conduct an OCR quality risk analysis. The last point I would make is to be aware that most organizations are not doing this work well. Don't use that as an excuse of misery likes company or everyone else is doing a poor job at it. In fact, the data is pretty compelling. Of 62 EPHI events, as I'll call them, which the Office for Civil Rights has pursued through a settlement agreement, resolution agreement, and/or a corrective action plan, 55 of those 62, 89%, you might as well think 9 out of 10 organizations had adverse findings when it came to doing an OCR quality risk analysis. Now, my final point is this. There are some individuals and some organizations who will say to you, it's impossible to do this. How could OCR ever expect that a large health system, a large integrated delivery network would ever be able to get its arms around all of its information assets and go through the detailed steps at the level of granularity suggested here and in the guidance itself? Don't buy it. OCR expects, and in fact, number 10 on that list you'll see is one that we've added. We have seen OCR increase its standard of excellence or increase its standard of care, so to speak, when it comes to conducting OCR quality risk analysis. So I would encourage you to review the guidance that OCR has published, as well as several of the other references and resources provided to help you conduct an OCR quality risk analysis. What I covered in this episode was an overview of an OCR quality risk analysis, lots of material, and one of our longer sessions. We covered 3 key things. Number 1, the basic components of risk: an asset, a threat, and a vulnerability. Number 2, we talked about the mindset of a risk analyst as compared to the mindset of a compliance analyst. And last but not least, number 3, we talked about the 9 essential elements of an OCR quality risk analysis. As always, I am ending the session with some suggested actions as well as references and resources that I hope you find useful in evaluating the extent to which you have met the OCR quality requirements for risk analysis. I encourage you, while the material is still somewhat fresh in your mind, to consider undertaking some of these actions and certainly reviewing some of the materials that have been provided. In the next episode, we're going to continue the conversation about an OCR quality risk analysis, and we're going to talk about 3 additional factors or components of risk. We've touched upon them here, but we'll go into them in more detail. Number 1, we'll talk about this notion of the likelihood of a bad thing happening. That is, the likelihood of a threat exploiting a particular vulnerability. Number 2, we'll talk about the impact were that bad thing to happen. That is, were the threat to exploit that vulnerability. And number 3, we'll tie that into the concept of controls, because the likelihood of a bad thing happening and the impact of it happening are going to be influenced by the controls that you do or do not have in place, the upshot of which is it will inform us in those areas where we have gaps and our more serious, more critical exposures to prioritize the implementation and the selection of those safeguards and controls. Until then, please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you've not already done so. Be well, be secure, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.